Welcome to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. On today's show, we're going back to the 1800s to see how severe weather stopped the British from gaining ground in America. Plus, what if the storms never happened? Our What If segment reveals how this could have led to another city becoming our nation's capital. And we break down why tornadoes are more common in the United States than any other place in the world. It all starts now on Invisible Iceberg. The War of 1812 sparked years of conflict between America and Great Britain. Fresh off a battle with France, led by Napoleon Bonaparte, British soldiers locked in with the U.S. over territory. The British gained a slight edge when they occupied Washington, D.C. in 1814. But rounds of severe weather would change everything. It's one of the many interesting stories in the book Invisible Iceberg, when climate and weather shaped history. Here with more fascinating details on this historic event is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Joel. Always an interesting story. Let's talk about what was the War of 1812.
The politics of the day were that there was conflict between the United States and Britain and the United States and France. And they were at war, as they have been almost continuously. And so we were siding more with France. But even some of the French were attacking our ships when they thought they were going to Britain. And Britain attacked our ships when they thought they were going to France. And what the British did when they captured our ships, the men, Americans, were put into the British Navy. The argument was that, well, you were British citizens before you were American, so you owe it to us, and so this was a problem, and it caused conflict. And there was some feeling in D.C. that we should declare war on France, other feeling we should declare war on Britain. Remember, this is just a few decades after we gained our independence, and we don't learn a lot about this war. Most of in history we talk about the Revolutionary War, but this is a fascinating period. And there was not uniformity in thought in Washington. President Madison barely got a declaration of war passed. I think it was the closest vote ever in a declaration of war by the United States.
How did the war go initially?
Well, it was back and forth. We captured Toronto, which was called York, and we burned it to the ground. So the British felt they had to then come to Washington and burn it to the ground, which they did. And in fact, if it wasn't for the weather, they may have stayed in Washington. And who knows what would have happened to the history of the United States, because the President Madison had to, and his wife had to abandon the White House just before the British came. Luckily, they got out. Supposedly they hadn't. They had to escape, and Britain sat there in the seat of power of the United States.
Things did get a little better for the Americans as the war dragged on.
Actually, because of lack of communications, the British had agreed to most American demands to not have the war, but that message didn't get back until after the U.S. had already declared war on Britain. Same thing at the end of the war. Right. The Battle of New Orleans, which the United States won, but the peace treaty had been agreed to 15 days before, but word did not get to British or American troops in New Orleans prior to that. And so a lot of Americans say, hey, we won the war because of that. The war was already settled before that resounding American victory in New Orleans.
The weather played a huge role in this war, specifically when the British came into Washington, D.C.
And it may have saved the United States, just like the weather saved George Washington and America in the Revolutionary War. It was a hot, steamy day, the day before a weather event occurred, temperature 100 degrees. And the British soldiers experienced very few casualties. Most Americans had left, had abandoned the city. They burned it. In fact, in burning a storage area, led to the loss of the most amount of British soldiers, over 30 or 35 British soldiers, because they, by accident, blew up a powder keg of ammunition in Washington. But they were in control, and they were sitting in Congress, and they were sitting in the all the office buildings and feeling very superior, when all of a sudden the next day this rainstorm comes in, and then there are tornadoes. And the tornadoes actually killed more British soldiers than the Americans had. Very disruptive, very unexpected. Of course, no warnings in those days, and the British really weren't familiar with tornadoes. Tornadoes aren't that common in Washington along the East Coast, but they happen. And when they happen, they can be much more severe than they ever are in Britain. So the British had no idea of what a tornado was, and these tornadoes did do significant damage, and may have even been intensified by the fire, that because a lot of heat and so on, was already hot and humid, and so they were rainstorms with wind, and then a tornado came through, killed a lot of British soldiers, and so they abandoned D.C.
There's some thought that the rain actually did put out a lot of the fires, although by the time it arrived, they had already pretty much burnt the Capitol building down.
Well, the city,
the whole city.
Most of the buildings had to be completely rebuilt. Of all that, and the weather to some degree included, was, do you rebuild in Washington, or do you move the Capitol to Philadelphia? And a lot of debate, and by only 5 votes was Washington kept as the capital. So depending on how that weather, if it was more severe, who knows, Philadelphia might be the capital today.
Amazing story. Dr. Joel Myers, thanks for sharing it.
My pleasure.
Joining us right now is author and historian Don Hickman. Don, thanks for joining us here today.
My pleasure.
All right, let's get into it. The War of 1812. What was the cause and the mission?
Well, the United States went to war against Great Britain in 1812 in order to force the British to give up certain maritime practices on the high seas that they were pursuing in order to win their war against Napoleonic France. The 2 big issues were the Orders in Council, series of executive orders issued by the Crown that restricted American trade with the continent of Europe, and under the authority of which the British seized 400 or 500 American ships, and impressment, which was the British practice of stopping American merchant vessels on the high seas, removing seamen on the grounds that they were British subjects, and conscripting them into the Royal Navy.
Why did the British decide to invade Washington, D.C.?
Well, because they controlled the high seas, they blockaded the American coast. They could operate very nearly with impunity along the coast, and it was a convenient target. It would be extremely embarrassing to the United States if its capital was conquered as it was. It had no real great strategic value, but it certainly had a lot of moral value. It's the only time in our history, at least since the Revolution, that our capital has been occupied by a foreign army.
Was there a weather impact on the war overall, and specifically in the nation's capital?
There was an impact, really, especially in the north. The war was fought mainly on the Canadian-American frontiers. The winters were brutal. There was frostbite on both sides, and the Indians suffered the most because they were British allies, and we pursued a scorched earth policy against the Indians, destroying their lodging and their food supplies. And a lot of Indians died of starvation, disease, and exposure during this war. So the weather played a very real role in enabling the United States to prosecute the war on the northern frontier.
And was the survival of Washington, D.C. as the capital in doubt?
Well, it was. And you asked about the weather. There were 2 heavy storms, probably 100-mile-an-hour winds during the British occupation. It only lasted about 24 hours. But one of the buildings that some British soldiers were housed in collapsed, killing them. It was a pretty bad experience for the occupation force.
And how did the war end? What was decided by the treaty ending the war?
Well, that's a great question. There's an old saw that everybody's happy with the outcome of the war. The Americans are happy because they think they won.
Right.
The Canadians are happier because they know they won, and the British are happiest of all because they've forgotten all about it. And that's more or less true, although it ignores the Indians in the Old Northwest and the Old Southwest. They were the big losers. In Tecumseh's War in the Northwest, Creek War in the Southwest, they were defeated, and that opened the door to westward expansion in those two regions.
Author and historian Don Hickey, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Bernie.
Still to come, we'll explain why geography makes the United States a prime spot for tornadoes. But next, in our What If segment, we'll explore how Washington, D.C. might be different if it weren't for a round of severe weather in 1812. Welcome back to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. It's time to jump into our What If segment to look at how America would be different if this round of severe weather never hit D.C. Back with us now is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg: When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. So a tornado and thunderstorm saved Washington, D.C. What if those thunderstorms didn't hit? Or the tornadoes actually didn't hit Washington, D.C., which in a sense forced the British out of our nation's capital. How would things have been different, you think?
Well, think back to then. Of course, we didn't have warnings. The weather changed regularly. Britain has different weather than the United States. This was a hot, sultry summer day period, and then all of a sudden these vigorous thunderstorms come through and tornadoes, disruptive, killing soldiers, causing damage and so on, and forcing the British troops to abandon D.C. If that hadn't happened, Britain had control of the nation's capital, the seat of power. Suppose they stayed, and the peace treaty might have been very different. Maybe we had to cede things back to Britain and surrender and so on. So you can imagine all kinds of different outcomes. So clearly, those tornadoes forced the British out of Washington. The president was able to return along with other government officials, and that really changed the course of the war in some ways.
If there was a hero of the War of 1812, it was Andrew Jackson. How did this propel him and his career moving forward?
Well, he won the Battle of New Orleans, actually 15 days after the peace treaty had been agreed to, but he didn't know it, and the British didn't know it because there was lack of communications. I mean, this is over 200 years ago. But it certainly made him a national hero. Years later, he ran for president, lost the first time, but then was elected twice, served 8 years. So many times war heroes have become presidents. Dwight Eisenhower, who was reputed to be the main general leader during World War II, and we've had other instances, Grant after the Civil War, and so on.
Let's talk about President Madison. He was the president during the War of 1812. How was he viewed? How was his leadership viewed during this time?
Well, the whole war was somewhat controversial. He wanted the war. He wanted it against the British. He got it passed by Congress, the declaration of war, but it was by a narrow margin. Typically, when the United States has declared war, it's been overwhelming support by Congress. That was not the case in this time. So there was not universal support for President Madison.
And what was decided by the treaty ending the war? What were the terms?
It went more or less back where it was before the war. There was no big gain for Britain or the United States. There were some minor effects. Of course, one of the reasons the United States went to war, either they knew it ahead of time or were thinking about it, was to to take over Canada, make Canada part of the United States. And it's interesting that it was true then, and it's true now. This is the longest non-militarized border in the world between the United States and Canada. Common language for the most part, common traditions, somewhat different politics, obviously different political system, but no huge differences.
It's amazing that that border was settled in 1812 and it still exists today. I'm not sure if there's a border like that anywhere in the world, is there?
Interesting point. Yeah. That's what the commonality between most of Canada, Americans and such, and there's no sign that any change will ever occur there in the future.
How did the war, of course, 1812, how did the war inspire the national anthem? It was written by Francis Scott Key during the War of 1812.
Yeah, he was imprisoned on a British ship in Baltimore Harbor and inspired to write the national anthem, which has been our national anthem now for over 200 years. And of course, he talks about the bombs bursting in air, illuminating the flag. But there was rain that night. Could there have been thunderstorms and lightning? He didn't mention it in the Star Spangled Banner, but it's quite possible the flag was also illuminated by lightning.
And one wonders how would have things been different if there was a decisive victory, let's say on the American side, and Canada and the U.S. would have merged in locations. That would be, and the way in which we even conduct our weather services, by the way, in the United States and Canada are far different even today. One wonders how things would have been different.
I don't know if they're far different, but there's significant differences, certainly, and even in the radars and so on. So it would have been much more uniform. And for the most part, Canada is more liberal than the United States. So who knows what the politics would have been, the influence, how many states Canada would have made up with the United States. One can speculate forever as to how that would have turned out.
We've had other fascinating stories about war, certainly the D-Day invasion, and here we're talking about tornadoes, and I'm sure for the British soldiers, this must have been one of the scariest scenes they've seen, not used to seeing them, certainly in the UK.
Well, here they had won, they forced all the Americans out, they controlled D.C., and then this horrendous weather comes in and just destroys things. Very disruptive, very scary.
I'm just getting out of here after that. That's what I assumed they were probably thinking.
Yeah, well, they were decimated.
Yeah. All right. A great story, Dr. Joe. Thanks for sharing it with us.
My pleasure.
Up next, why are there more tornadoes in the United States than any other country in the world? We'll break it down after the break. Welcome back to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. Tornadoes have been recorded on every continent except Antarctica, with North America at the top of the list for both frequency and severity. In particular, the United States averages nearly 1,200 tornadoes per year, which is more than Canada, Australia, and all European countries combined. In addition, violent tornadoes are more common in the United States than any other country. The geography of the United States is unique and plays a key role in tornado climatology. No place else in the world has the large, warm water on its equatorial side with a wide, high range of mountains extending from north to south to the west of it. The Rocky Mountains help funnel polar air from Canada southward and moist Gulf of Mexico air northward. Meanwhile, desert air from Mexico often sweeps northward, and it's the clash of these air masses that creates violent thunderstorms that can produce tornadoes when atmospheric winds change with speed and direction with height. Tornadoes are most prevalent in the central United States. The top three states are Texas, Kansas, and Oklahoma, and of course, the size of Texas does play a huge role in the statistics. Conversely, there are a number of states and districts where tornadoes do not occur on average every year. Most of them are in New England. Curiously, though, Washington, D.C. is on the list. However, it is the relatively small size of the District of Columbia that is the primary reason, as border states of Virginia and Maryland average a few tornadoes per year. That's our show for today. For more information and get your copy of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History by Dr. Joel Myers, go to invisibleiceberg.com. If you have any questions or comments, send us an email at questions@AccuWeather.com. We look forward to seeing you next time.